Another type of frames and arrows problem is when we have a frames and arrow problem with two rules instead of just one. So if we look at the following example, we have the first rule, which is add 3 for the solid colored arrow, and we have a second rule, which is subtract 2 for the dashed kind of arrow. So if we start at 5, we see a dashed arrow, so that tells us we have to take 2 away, and we get to 3. If we go from 3, we see a solid colored arrow, so that means that we add 3 and we get to 6. From the 6, we have a dashed arrow, which means we subtract 2, so 6 minus 2 is 4. Then from the 4, again, we have a dashed arrow, which is minus 2, and we get to another 2. So with these particular types of frames and arrows problems, I strongly recommend putting the actual rule above each of the arrows so you do not get confused as you are solving. In this example, we have the first rule on our solid arrow, which is add 5, and we have our second rule of minus 3 on our dashed arrow. If I start with jumping over my two empty frames and jumping to my first number, I have an 8. So if I take the 8, I have a solid colored arrow, which means I have to add 5. If I add 5 to 8, I get the number 13. To go from 13 to my next frame, I have a dashed line with dashed arrow, which means I have to subtract 3. If I take 13 minus 3, I get a number of 10. To go from 10 to my next frame, I have a solid color line, so I'm adding 5. If I take 10 plus 5, I get an answer of 15. To go from the 15 to the dashed colored or the dashed arrow, that means I am subtracting 3, and I would get an answer in this particular frame. Now, remember, when you're looking at the very beginning of this frame, we have some numbers that are missing. So are you going to have to remember to work backwards and do the opposite? So to go from 8 to figure out the number that would go here, it's a dashed line, which means subtract 3, but I have to do the opposite. I have to add 3. Keep that in mind as you're working. I want you to finish and practice on your own. Fill in number 4 on your video notes guide.